Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar hosted by APAC Med. You are joining us today because we've just launched our first policy paper on health data, which is entitled Advancing Real-World Evidence in Asia Pacific. So my name is Tom Chang, and I'm the project manager with APAC Med under the Digital Health Committee. So in 2021, APAC Med collaborated with our knowledge partner, Crowell and Moring, or CNM, and we did a research on the use of real-world evidence, or RWE, for regulatory and reimbursement decision-making in the medtech industry. So in this paper, we have published a use case collection and also consulted with our RWE experts during our public-private dialogue session. So for today, the agenda will have Clark Jennings, the managing director from CNM, to walk you through the highlights of the paper. Unfortunately, he's not able to join us live today because he's currently away in the US, but I'll be showing you a video recording of his presentation. And then we'll have a 30-minute panel discussion where we have invited two of our guest speakers, Tracy Duffy from TGA, Australia, and also Heather Colvin from J&J. So this session will be moderated by Anne Bousset from Abbott Diagnostics. And just a reminder that you can ask questions anytime during this session by putting them in the chat box function. So I thought I would quickly introduce APAC Med and our Digital Health Committee. For those of you who don't know us, we are the only regional trade association to provide a collective voice for the medtech industry in Asia Pacific. And whilst APAC Med was founded in 2014, the Digital Health Committee was recently established back in 2020. So we are about 250 members strong, and they represent over 75 companies. Our secretariat team in the Digital Health Committee is led by Roberta. Our board sponsor is Elizabeth Staudinger, who is the head of APAC for Siemens Healthineers. And what we really do in this committee is to support our members with a digital product journey, focusing on 4 key areas. So we have regulatory, cybersecurity, reimbursement, and interoperability. So I think we can all agree that the use of evidence-based health data is getting increasingly relevant and important for Asia Pacific, whether it's for regulatory or reimbursement purposes. And this is why we decided to embark on this project and to really understand what are some of the trends, best practices, and the challenges of adopting RWE in this region. So next, I will introduce you to the video of Clark, who's going to present the paper and talk about the 5 recommendations for policymakers to consider. So Clark is an attorney who has held senior roles in the US government before coming to Asia. So now he manages the regional operations for CNM International. And CNM International is a global public policy consultancy, and they have over 30 years of experience working with medical technology companies on policy making, regulatory harmonization, and efforts across the region. So let me share with you the video.
Well, thanks so much, Tom. I'm really pleased to be representing CNM International with all of you here today. And quickly, for those who don't know, we're a global public affairs, government relations, and public policy consulting firm. We're based in Washington, D.C., and I manage our regional office here in Singapore. And I'm proud to say that we are not only members of APAC Med, but we are also frequent collaborators, particularly with the Digital Health Committee, which has driven the work that we're going to talk about today. So we were thrilled to work with the committee over the course of the last year to examine a policy and an issue area that is rising in prominence and awareness, but also in importance to the industry and to policymakers and governments as healthcare systems continue their evolution to be more evidence-driven and patient-centric. And I am referring, of course, to the utilization of real-world evidence to drive healthcare decision-making. So we are pleased to help develop this paper that we're launching today on key policy considerations to advance real-world evidence and its utilization in the Asia Pacific. And I want to spend a few minutes to talk about our discussions, what we learned, and insights that we share in the policy paper. So to begin with, by virtue of being on this call today, I probably don't need to introduce the concepts of real-world data and real-world evidence, and we do that anyway in the paper. But where the paper really starts is by outlining many of the benefits that the use of RWE brings to healthcare systems and to policymakers tasked with understanding how medical products work in the real world in a practical setting. And these benefits include the ability of RWE to generate practical, actionable evidence at greater efficiency in terms of time and often overall cost when compared to traditional clinical trials. Its value in helping accelerate the delivery of innovative medical products to the market, as well as in demonstrating the safety and efficacy of those products, and thereby helping improve overall access to care. RWE's ability to help uncover new indications, new uses for medical products and technologies, which can have significant positive impacts for patient care. And finally, RWE's value in painting a more practical, realistic picture of the patient journey and how products and technologies perform in a truly real-world setting. And so all of these uses and benefits have the ability to help advance the concept of a next-generation, truly learning health system. One that is adaptable, more evidence-driven, more responsive to practical outcomes and realities of clinical practice and of how medical products perform under real patient use. But we also know that policy decisions will determine the critical role that real-world data and real-world evidence will play for future health systems. And therefore, the key question that we set out to examine with this work and this paper was this: how are regulators and policymakers able to utilize this data? And what are the key considerations that they're going to need to address in order to truly harness the power of real-world data and utilize the insights drawn from real-world evidence to drive better healthcare decision-making? And I want to quickly highlight two considerations that guided our discussions. First, we know obviously that RWE is already a linchpin for many post-market decisions once a product is safely in the marketplace. And so this can include utilization of real-world data for post-market surveillance, safety monitoring, or to review conditional pricing decisions or other coverage considerations once a product is, as I said, marketed in a country. But we wanted to think about the policy considerations that could help move the use of RWE earlier in the decision-making continuum. So for questions of market entry and pre-market approvals, as well as for pricing and initial coverage decisions. In other words, how can RWE create value earlier in the product lifecycle, as well as in engagement with policymakers? And that leads to the second quick point, which is we wanted to look holistically at both regulatory and at reimbursement and coverage decision-making, and where real-world evidence fits into both pictures. So with those guidelines in mind, we set out to better understand how RWE is being utilized for these decision-making processes in Asia. And so let's start at a high level with some very quick and general observations from the region. First, based on research and on discussions in our working group, there's general consensus that the biopharmaceutical industry has been traditionally more active than the medical device sector when it comes to utilizing RWE in its formal submissions to regulators and policymakers. It's not to say that one is more sophisticated than the other. It simply suggests that biopharma companies appear to have been more robust in incorporating RWE into their formal engagements with governments. And at least in what is publicly available, there's far less reporting and documentation of submissions related to medical technologies that incorporate RWE. And that's particularly true outside of the US, which leads us to the second point. And that is that integration of RWE for regulatory and policy decision-making remains what we would describe as an emerging practice in much of Asia. It will come as no surprise, likely, that the US and Europe are the established leaders in the development of guidance and policy frameworks to better incorporate RWE. And we looked for examples within Asia of formal guidance from regulators, as well as for tangible case studies where medical device authorities had relied on RWE in their reviews. And frankly, these were a bit harder to surface here in the region. And so the overall environment or ecosystem for how RWE is accepted for policy purposes is simply not yet as mature or robust as other global regions. But the good news is that this is changing. We reference examples in the paper of authorities across Asia that have recently begun to issue formal guidelines on the utilization of RWE. These are examples such as from NMPA in China, from Japan's PMDA, MFDS in Korea, and the Taiwan FDA. Much of this formal guidance has been developed and issued literally in just the last several years, however. And so it's very much still an evolving, fluid regulatory and policy-making environment. And so that raises the importance of collaborative engagement among government, industry, and other stakeholders, which is a topic that gets considerable discussion within the paper. So with that context in mind, we wanted to talk about some of the key challenges and questions that are going to need to be addressed in order to create a more enabling regulatory and policy environment in Asia that fully embraces RWE. And we've carefully framed the paper in just that fashion. We lay out what we call key policy considerations. In other words, these are some of the big buckets or big issue areas that are going to require deep engagement and collaboration between all stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem. We're not meaning to offer clear-cut answers necessarily on all these points. There's going to take a lot more work to do that. This is also not meant to be a technical paper. Rather, we wanted to lay the foundation for what we believe will be an ongoing dialogue within the APAC Med Digital Health Committee and among its members and experts and policymakers and governments, including those that are here with us today. So let's jump into those key considerations, and I'll walk through at a high level what those issue areas are and some of the initial recommendations that we've proposed. So first, formalizing models for public-private collaboration and policy innovation in this space will be absolutely critical. And all of us should be thinking about new efforts that can be launched here in Asia to help advance the overall dialogue and bring together the expertise on these issues. We purposefully listed this as the first consideration. It's a broad one, obviously, but we believe it is foundational to all other questions that we discuss in the paper. And the development of a holistic ecosystem approach for RWE innovation is critical. So in the paper, we gave particular focus in this section to an example from the US, the National Evaluation System for Health Technology, or NEST Coordinating Center. The mission of NEST is to bring together a diverse set of stakeholders, including from government, clinicians, industry associations, patient voice, payers, you name it, with a mandate, and I'll quote, to accelerate the development and translation of new and safe technologies, leveraging real-world evidence and innovative research. NEST is doing tremendous work related to data standards for RWE, which we'll talk about later, as well as demonstration projects to show how RWE can be used to meet regulatory and coverage requirements. And importantly, NEST was established through a grant from the US FDA. That grant went through the Medical Device Innovation Consortium and helped establish and stand up the NEST Coordinating Center. So it's an excellent example of truly public-private partnership and also shows the vision of government, in this case through the US FDA, to make these linkages and establish a durable, ongoing platform for this kind of work and research. And if we are obviously collectively going to build a truly robust ecosystem in Asia for these issues, this is the type of model that we need to consider replicating. Next, we make what sounds like an obvious assertion, which is that policymakers need to embrace RWE's potential, particularly to improve healthcare decision-making. But this suggestion has some important embedded considerations that we outline in the paper. First, clear public messaging from ministries and departments of health on the value of RWE is a critical and important first step for those countries who have not yet done so in Asia. This sends a clear signal to the market. It helps incentivize further partnerships, research, commercial activity, along with bringing new actors and expertise to engage with these governments to help expand the RWE environment. Now, this type of messaging can take many forms. Formal guidance, of course, is the standard and what we have strived to see more of here in Asia. In the paper, we reference, for example, the 21st Century Cures Act from the US and its clear mandate to establish formal frameworks to implement the FDA's RWE program. Within Asia, I've already touched on several of the med device authorities that have recently issued similar guidance. Australia is another great example, with the TGA there having recently undertaken a formal review of its RWE programs and utilization. And I expect you'll hear more about that in the discussion today. But short of formal guidance, we've also seen relevant authorities outside of Asia that have issued policy statements noting their intent to develop and formalize their approaches for RWE. And that also has a catalytic effect for new collaboration in the field. Next, when developing their guidance, and this is important, policymakers must define real-world data and RWE in a broad and inclusive manner. And there is no standardized, commonly accepted definition for what actually constitutes real-world data in the healthcare context. And so it's important that regulatory guidance be somewhat future-proof in this aspect, recognizing both traditional sources of RWD, things like registries and EHRs, claim databases, and so on, but also leaving room to incorporate new and emerging sources of data that are coming online through digital health tools and solutions practically every day. And similarly, it should be best practice for RWE to be incorporated into new policy and regulatory frameworks for digital health solutions specifically, and for emerging tech in the healthcare space. APAC Med has done tremendous work here, examining new approaches for things like software as a medical device and artificial intelligence in health products and systems. And as policymakers are grappling with how to regulate and engage with the continued digital health revolution, RWE's value is only going to become more visible and more prominent. And so we hope that risk-based frameworks will incorporate greater utilization of RWE to demonstrate the efficacy and safety and effectiveness of digitally enabled products. We know where the future is going. We need to ensure that RWE is baked in, so to speak, into that policy making and oversight as our health systems and technologies evolve. Next, this one is a complex issue, and that is, of course, how to incorporate the data itself. Now, these are incredibly technical issues. There's also a tremendous amount of good work being done right now globally, and we reference in the paper some of the organizations and initiatives that can be engaged and that are working on these issues. So we do not attempt to get into the technical standard setting elements that are going to be needed, among other issues, but we would obviously be remiss if we did not address these topics and their critical importance. And so what we've done is attempt to broadly outline some of the key challenges and point to some emerging best practices and global work related to healthcare data that will be relevant and important in the RWE context. And broadly speaking, as the title suggests, we've categorized these in two buckets. First, enabling access to health data. That is ensuring there are policy and the data governance frameworks in place to allow a broad range of healthcare stakeholders to utilize real-world data to improve health outcomes. And second, ensuring that real-world data and real-world evidence that is utilized for regulatory and policy processes is of sufficient quality and meets rigorous standards to truly be useful. So this means ensuring that the data is fit for purpose and truly regulatory grade. In effect, separating signal from noise, ensuring that the data that comes to policymakers is consistent, clean, and meets the criteria needed for proper review and use. So in this bucket, we offer a few high-level starting points on how to advance this important aspect of the conversation. First, we ultimately have to develop harmonized, consistent methods for data submission. Obviously, policymakers and regulators cannot review and make decisions related to medical technologies if the data is not consistent. Many of you are likely familiar with efforts to develop so-called common data models in the healthcare context. These efforts are not without their own challenges, but the work is intended to help encode and store health data in a more standardized manner. And it also incorporates good practices around issues like patient privacy and ensuring that protections and things like proper access control measures are instituted. It's also worth mentioning here the role of governments, which can be to clearly outline and guide industry and others on the types of real-world data and evidence drawn from that data that will be considered and that is sought for regulatory and reimbursement processes. And so drawing clear contours and guidance at the outset and communicating that within a domestic ecosystem that will help drive harmonization of what is ultimately submitted to government. And it also helps provide better signals as to the specific data that is sought and will be utilized by governments. Second, we know it's a core tenet of good regulatory practices to reference international standards and other recognized models. And the point here is that we do not have to recreate the wheel here in the region, where good models globally already exist. Work is being done that can be incorporated and referenced by authorities here in Asia. That includes, for example, in the IMDRF. We also discuss in the paper the data quality framework that is being developed by the NEST Coordinating Center, again in the US, as well as work from joint task forces that involve industry, regulators, and academics that are cataloging best practices for research and how data is disseminated from, for example, observational studies. And of course, Regulatory reliance is an important concept here as well. How can countries rely on the best of what has already been developed by other benchmark reference agencies for medical device oversight? And finally, industry-led voluntary frameworks related to data collection and quality have a role to play. Codes of conduct, for example, help level up practices and standards across industries and can define clear expectations and obligations for accountability, transparency, and security of patient data. Elements of codes of conduct could include, for example, efforts to ensure patient equities are represented when data policies are being developed, to mitigate the potential introduction of bias into data sets, or to ensure that patients are exercising truly informed consent related to the collection, use, and sharing of their health data. And the takeaway here being that we should welcome bottom-up voluntary efforts from industry and from others to set norms and ethical standards for how patient data will be utilized to advance public health outcomes. Go to the next slide. Next, we note that all of us as stakeholders are going to need to engage in a lot of capacity building work, both on the technical side and also within our healthcare workforces and within the ministries and departments that will create the relevant policies. So let's talk for a minute about what that means. First, we will not be able to fully embrace the potential for real-world data and evidence without the underlying infrastructure in place to accurately capture, store, share, and analyze it. In the previous section, we talked about the types and quality of data that policymakers can rely upon. Here, we're really starting at the ground level to talk about how we enable the creation and the sharing and use of that data to begin with. Now, we could take up multiple webinars just on this topic, but some of the elements that we raise include the development of strategic national roadmaps for healthcare IT and data systems. Singapore is a great example here. Obviously, there's a lot of similar work around the region in places like Korea, Japan, China, and Australia in recent years. But at the core of these plans is a structured approach to develop healthcare technology and data systems that can speak to one another, that endeavor toward that frequently cited goal of true interoperability. We also reference approaches like regulatory sandboxes for health data projects and companies, helping demonstrate the value of real-world data and health analytics in practical settings. And importantly, we spent some time discussing the need for harmonized implementation of unique device identifiers and UDI systems. We know the importance of UDIs for the med tech industry, and we need to see more robust use and implementation, particularly at the point of care, so we can properly capture that real-world data, tag it to a unique device, and understand how it relates to patient care and outcomes. Next, this element, however, is just as important, and it's a reminder for us to not forget the human element in all of this. No matter how much high-quality health data is aggregated and presented for use, we will not be able to unlock its value without skilled, trained practitioners in government and relevant bodies outside of government as well, those who understand how to effectively analyze and utilize that data, full stop. This is a large challenge to bite off, of course, and I mentioned that we just wanted to flag some of these big picture challenges, but this is certainly a topic area that we all need to be thinking about and engaging on. And we do raise a few examples of how to get started. We cite the US FDA's experiential learning program as one model, where regulatory review staff conduct site visits to a range of healthcare facilities across research, manufacturing, and clinical settings to see firsthand the development and utilization of medical devices and truly understand industry practices. That would be relatively easy to replicate here in Asia. We also talk about the development of RWE advisory committees, bringing outside expertise and perspectives into the ministries and departments and providing more technical capacity into these conversations. Again, a relatively simple step, but these are the types of low-hanging fruit that should be replicated and started immediately and that can have impact over the long term. And finally, consortium approaches and partnerships will be critical to this element. Government does not need to do this alone. Leveraging the talents and expertise within academia, within industry and other expert groups, and figuring out how to upskill the needed proficiencies related to healthcare data is going to be an urgent but also ongoing priority for all of us if we're serious about utilizing RWE to its maximum potential. And finally, we need to promote collaboration among regulators and in the international community. There are already models for formalizing this type of collaboration. The US and the EU are doing it already on RWE, and we cite a great example from the pharma space where the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, working alongside the WHO, launched a series of workshops to discuss the importance of global collaboration on RWE to facilitate regulatory decision-making on COVID-19 treatments and vaccines. Those are their words. We'd like to see more collaborations like this within Asia and with Asian authorities and their other global counterparts. Of course, work can be done in regional forums, places like in APAC or in the Asian Harmonization Working Party, and in forums like the IMDRF, but the point is simply to engage. And if these forums are not sufficient to take into account the nuances and the distinct challenges of policy making in the Asian context, then new forums can be launched, plain and simple. But the time is ripe to see stronger collaboration, more robust engagement, both among stakeholders in our respective domestic markets, but also in the international community. And all of us here today need to be advocates to promote that kind of needed collaboration. So I will close by simply saying thank you for the opportunity to collaborate with the APAC Med and the member companies and engage with the officials and experts who joined our policy roundtable discussion. Utilizing RWD for policy making and healthcare decision making presents both an incredible opportunity, as we know, but also significant challenges and issues that are going to have to be addressed. And as I've said here today, we believe the best way to do this is bringing together the expertise and perspectives of a broad range of stakeholders. I know there's interest to continue that work within APAC Med to dig into further technical details about how to implement new standards and bring together new partnerships. And we hope that this paper serves as a strong foundation for those continued discussions, helps provide some context about how to go about this work that's going to need to be done in Asia in order to truly embrace the promise and potential of real-world evidence. So thanks very much. I appreciate your time. I hope the rest of the conversation today is fruitful, and I look forward to the discussions. Thanks.
Okay, so that's Clark Jennings from CNM International giving us a good overview of the paper. Next, we'll move on to the panel discussion, and I'll hand it over to Anne, who is the Regional Director, Market Access from Abbott, and she's also our former chair for our reimbursement working group in APAC Med. Anne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm very honored to be invited here to moderate this topic that I'm really passionate about, both because I have been generating real-world evidence, both in the pharma industry as well as medical devices, and that I have used real-world evidence for reimbursement and access. So this is really a topic that is very close to my heart. I am joined by two esteemed panelists, Tracy Duffy, who is the First Assistant Secretary for Medical Devices and Product Quality Division for the TGA, which is the Australian regulatory agency. So her expertise is extremely valuable, as not only she's responsible for the medical device regulation, so pre-market as well as post-market, but also recently the TGA has released a report on real evidence and patient-reported outcomes and how we can enhance its use for policy decision makings. So thank you very much, Tracy, for joining us. And the second panelist that I have pleasure to welcome is Heather Coleman. She's the Director for Evidence and Outcomes Policy for Johnson & Johnson MedTech. And she is working to advance the adoption of innovative evidence approaches that includes real-world evidence, the science of patient inputs, and in diversity and inclusion in clinical evidence. So definitely, given her very extensive experience, she is absolutely passionate about evidence and real-world evidence, and we're looking forward to hearing her insights. the first thing that I wanted to introduce for the panel discussion is maybe first of all, the distinction between real world evidence and real world data that we do hear a lot and interchangeably. So just a clarification is that when we talk about real world data, the notion of data conveys the fact that we are referring to the simple factual information that the data conveys. And when we're talking about real world evidence, as the word evidence says, it infers more an organization of the information to help drive the reader to a conclusion or assist in a decision. And for today's panel discussion, we'll be focusing more on the decision for regulatory approval, given the expertise from our two guest panelists. So the first question that I would like to ask our panelists is that we heard from Clark that there is really great value in using real-world evidence for work. Can you share some specific examples, both from the two perspectives, so the regulatory perspective and the industry perspective, on what do you see as the value for you in your line of work? And maybe if I can ask Tracy to start sharing the policymaker perspective.
Thank you, Anne, and good morning to everyone. First of all, thank you for the opportunity for the TGA not to only contribute to the collation of the report, because it's a really valuable report to have been able to be part of and also to see published now, but also the session today and the ongoing collaboration and engagement. As Clark mentioned, it's really important that this global topic continues to I guess, support not only regulators and policymakers, but those companies who are developing or have developed products that require and rely on real-world evidence. As Clark mentioned, and I think Anne also mentioned, the TGA did a review of how we used real-world evidence and data as part of the pre-regulatory and post-market processes. And what we found, unsurprisingly, was we did use a lot of real-world evidence and data, both of which in our post-market activities. But whilst we currently accept real-world evidence and data as part of our pre-submission and submissions of applications for regulatory approval, we found amongst those stakeholders that we interviewed that there was limited use, and the communication of how and what and when to provide that information to the TGA was very limited. So we published our review on our website, and our review indicated some steps that we were taking to help clarify the difference between evidence and data, what information from either of those sources would be useful and acceptable for regulatory approval here in Australia, and some of the challenges and areas where there does need to be more focus. And those areas are really around, first of all, the definitions. Are we talking about the same thing? And are those pieces of information used for the right purpose and the same purpose? So the definitions are really important, and the difference between, as Anne said, evidence and data. The sources of data and the quality of the data were the next area, and it's pleasing to see that this report signals that they are two really important considerations. Existing guidelines and standards, we recognise that for the TGA, we need to improve and put out more information and guidance to companies so that you do understand how and when and what you can provide as part of your applications. And I think also there are some types of devices, I'll talk about devices here in particular, some types of devices that are better suited for the application of being able to use and submit real world evidence. And I'm really focused on those emerging technologies that rely on software, and how over the past 2 years in the COVID pandemic, we've seen a huge proliferation of software enabled and connectedness to healthcare that has required faster decisions and access to changes to treatment of patients. So building on those types of devices and use of software and real world evidence, where that is the only evidence that you're going to have, which is captured by certain apps or devices, whether in the hospital setting or in a personal sense, lends itself to really forging this work forward at a really tremendous pace. I think for the emergence, we've been also thinking about the emergence of more personalized medicine, where there is a device, a medicine and diagnostic tests, all and the clinician and the patient all working together, and what role patient reported outcomes and real world evidence and data supports in that scenario. And through the IMDRF, the International Medical Devices Regulator Forum, we are doing some work on artificial intelligence and machine learning, which will also contribute to the conversation about real world evidence. So there's just some thoughts that we've been having, but yeah, the difference between evidence and data is really important, and the clarification of when to use what pieces of information, so important for regulators. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you very much, Tracy. And I think it's a great perspective on how some of these real-world evidence are more suitable for some types of devices, and how we can accelerate access to these innovations. So that leads me to Heather from industry perspective, where the objective is really how can we get these innovations into the hands of patients as soon as possible. Can you share some of your perspective and specific examples on the value of real-world evidence?
Yeah, so I just want to touch on the point real quickly about the definitions, because I think it's really critical. And as you saw in the report, the idea of keeping that definition of what we consider real-world data broad, because there are new and emerging types of data sources that are coming out all the time. Like when you think about it, all the apps and wearables and different sensors that are out there now, they're all generating data, and we want to be able to capture and use that. So keeping that definition broad is really important, which is one of the reasons I'm particularly fond of the US FDA definition, which is real-world data is that data related to the patient health status and delivery of routine health care from a variety of sources. So it's broad enough to leave the door open for future data sources. But I think that the other piece there in talking about real-world evidence is that next step is really rigorous and appropriate study design and protocol development. That's critical, because I think regulators, and I don't want to speak for Tracy and other regulators, there is this concern that there's going to be kind of widespread data mining, and that will lead to people just running various models till they get the answer they want. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to look at the principles that we outlined about the need to ensure the trustworthiness of the evidence we're putting forward when we're looking at real-world evidence. And that's really built around transparency of your a priori protocol designs. And so really important piece there. But from the industry perspective, like one of the key things is, of course, we want to be able to use new types of evidence to support regulatory submissions. But at the heart of everything we do, it's more important for us to better understand the patient experience. When you look at the second principle that we have outlined in the paper, it's about capturing that patient experience with the product and their healthcare journey. And the ability is we have all these new emerging IT health systems to start building into that, the capability to be able to use data from that everyday healthcare experience and from people's lives to better understand their health, their outcomes, and the factors that influence that is really critical, both for us in identifying places where innovation is needed or improvement, but also to capture where innovation's happening in the clinical experience. We create products, but once in the hands of clinicians, a lot of innovation takes place there. And we need to be able to capture it, one, to see where it's benefiting patients, but also to make sure that they're not being used inappropriately. That safety piece is critical as well. So when we talk about, where does real world evidence fit into our evidentiary picture, it's that portfolio of the total evidence package, where we have our traditional sources of clinical evidence and bench testing. But those are really, I like the bad analogy that I use is a lot of our traditional sources of clinical evidence are like the tiger in the zoo, carefully controlled environment with the perfect diet and 24/7 veterinary care. And that's really important to understanding the biology and all the issues around like what a tiger's life is like. But what we really care about is what is the tiger in the wild experience. And so real world evidence for us is that opportunity to, once we have that understanding of the tiger in the zoo, we can take that and see what the tiger in the wild is experiencing. So bad, but useful analogy. And I think that those are some key points. And I want to kind of touch on another point that came up, which is the partnership that's needed. We're working on this together as we move forward, and it's really important for industry and regulators and academia to work together with our clinical community and our patients to kind of learn as we're going. We make sure that we're appropriately using this information. And so the role of those partnerships is really important. I'll just cite, the example out of NMPA with the Henan Boao project that they have there, where they are doing pilots to kind of work collaboratively to develop real world evidence pilots. That's a real life example where we're seeing some success. From J&J's experience, we participated in an early project there, and we had the Catalyst surgical system, laser surgical system, that had been on the market in the EU and the US for over a decade. But because of kind of the evidentiary requirements to have clinical evidence from inside of China, the kind of business decision was that it was impractical to bring it to that market. Well, within that pilot, we were able to, building on the 2 pivotal trials that already had existed for the product, do supplemental RWE evidence generation, and that product is now on the market in China. And so we can see that, it's the RWE is that missing puzzle piece that we need to include, and that's how we can look at it as enhancing the overall evidentiary package. So those are some of the opportunities we see kind of moving forward, is that partnership to work together and then figure out how RWE fits that puzzle piece.
Great, thank you very much, Heather, for sharing. Again, the value of the real-world evidence, and especially that patient-centric view, putting the patient in its in the real life and in the local setting to understand exactly how we can really capture that value and how innovation can really enhance and improve the patient outcomes. So both of you actually have already touched based on where you would see are already some of the challenges around the adoption of real-world evidence in Asia Pacific. So I'm conscious about the time. So I would like to move to now more in terms of what the audience might be very interested in. Your perspective is how do you think that we can address some of these challenges around the data quality, transparency, among other things, but also, but most really importantly, that clarity on how we can use real-world evidence to support policymakers and inform decision makings, and especially really how can we use this paper that Clark has shared to really help support that that work, both for policymakers from Tracy perspective, and for Heather, how the industry can also use that paper to in the discussions with policymakers. So maybe Tracy, if you could share your perspective on that topic.
Sure, thanks. I think the value in bringing people together to develop a paper like this not only lies in the process of the people who have contributed to the paper, but then, as you've explained, and how you actually use it going forward. And it's not of value if it sits on your website and it's not taken up and taken seriously. And I think the commitment and the collaboration and the effort put into bringing some of these things to be explored in this paper also needs to be reciprocated by those parties taking that back. So, you know, where we heard the examples from the US, and we've heard some examples from myself and examples from Heather representing, you know, the medical device companies and other policymakers. It's about the ownership of considering what's been put into this paper as part of their ongoing conversations and discussions. And so that's where the value is. And over time, I think that with any policy process, policies start off with a paper like this, and then they evolve, and then they get contributed to by many others. So I would see that places like NEST and other regulators and other policymakers will look to this paper, see where it makes sense for them to take the essence and the value of it, build on it, improve on it, and contribute back into ongoing and future conversations and discussions. I think there are other activities that can occur, and we touched around standards and data and protocol designs and better guidance. So I think that's where there needs to be taking on board some of the recommendations that come out of this paper, and for those organisations who are responsible for those pieces of work to progress them with the knowledge that's been harnessed through this process. And I was so fast to say is, you know, thinking about how it can relate to registries and the construct of registries. Here in Australia, we have many medical device registries. And so some of the conversations will be about, you know, how do registries move to that patient-reported outcome approach and use of the data in registries that can feed back into regulatory decisions and later on maybe reimbursement decisions. But big data and connected data and bias in data, I think, is something that does need to be considered, because whilst you're talking about the Asia Pacific area, sometimes depending on where the data comes from, there are some biases in the data. So it's not an easy task, but I think there are many willing players who want to contribute to it and take this paper as a really good starting point.
Thank you very much, Tracy. And Heather, how would you see using this paper to shape policies that Tracy has so well articulated on how this paper can be a building block in engaging in and continuing the conversation?
Well, I absolutely echo Tracy's comments about taking it back and working on it and partnering in different ways. So thinking about some of the different partnerships that are already happening that are looking at like data quality. So I know in South Korea, you know, there's a partnership that I know J&J and other manufacturers are working on with the healthcare system, Samsung healthcare system, to look at really advancing the capability of real-world evidence generation by looking at the data source. So I think that, you know, those types of partnerships that are trying to tackle part of the puzzle need to continue to advance. I think that the point that Tracy made is really valid about, like, there's a lot of issues with real-world data sources and that they're not this clean, pristine data source. But I think what we need to look at is there's a lot of work that's happening outside in academia in organizations like ISPOR and ISPE, as well as organizations like NEST, where they're looking at data maturity models, where it's understanding, like doing a data set characterization, and then really taking that to the next step when you're doing your study design and doing a fit for purpose assessment of the data source and the individual data elements to your specific question. And I think one of the things we could all do is work on understanding that data maturity model, and then understanding what are the steps that need to take place and characterizing those well for how do you then do that fit for purpose assessment. And I know that's one of the things we've been advocating for in the US and in different regions is really how do we understand that? Because there's a lot of work that's happening that we could capture. So pull from the broader ecosystem to inform that work. I do think that I wanted to put a plug in for, one of the things Tracy said earlier, which is digital health is a thing that is not going away. And it really can jumpstart a lot of this because we have the ability to, in the design and development, integrate data generation as a key component. So in many ways, these digital technologies and the new digital health tools can leapfrog over traditional medical devices because they can start generating data from day one that we can then, under a well-designed protocol, turn into evidence. So I think that these are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about is like, how do we look at these new innovative technologies? How do we capture what the broader ecosystem is already doing and take that learning and build it in? And then how do we really partner effectively to build out tools for policymakers and for industry, frankly, to have a clear pathway to do this work together?
Thank you so much, Heather, which is a great transition to my next question, which is that we have seen the pandemic has really accelerated the digitization of healthcare systems and also the acceleration of adoption of these digital health tools that you have just mentioned, which creates such a wealth of data, that we are, as evidence generation people, are really very much excited about. But we'd really like to ride on this momentum to see how we can leverage on these real-world data. What do you think are some of the policies to consider in order to put them in practice? A little bit what Heather has just concluded on these policies. So Heather, any thoughts that you'd like to share?
Well, I think my plug is, is really my plug is for us to collaboratively work on how do we come up with a reasonable, responsible set of criteria for doing that fit for purpose assessment to the study question and understanding the appropriateness of the data to the study question. And I think that's something that regulators and researchers and industry need to sit at a table and walk through together. Right. So that's the key thing.
Thank you very much. And Tracy, really from the policymakers' perspective.
So I think from a policymakers, from a regulator's point of view, we have a risk-based approach. So coming back to my point that I made earlier about some types of devices are better suited to the utilization of real-world evidence than others, there will always be a place for the traditional clinical trials, and there should always be that because of the nature of the device and the nature of harm that potentially could be identified and the risk to patients. So when it comes to digital health, what we've found is that companies that aren't usual medical device companies are now exploring these opportunities. And from a regulator's point of view, the level of knowledge and understanding of what things need to be considered when you're dealing with medical and patient information, as well as leading to treatments and decisions about treatments. They sometimes start off with a good idea, but don't put the protocols and practices in place to start collecting the data from the start. So when it comes time for their digital device or their digital health solution to move into that medical device sphere of being regulated, they've not had or paid attention to the building blocks that lead them to that, because it just happens so quickly and it's what the clinicians ask for. So in terms of digital health and policymakers, there should be an ongoing encouragement that if there is any organisation that is adopting digital health, that they have a mind's eye to where the endpoint may eventually take them. And if it takes them into a regulated area, they should be thinking about what that means in terms of their pathway to the regulatory approval and what data and information they're going to require for that, and do that planning, because that investment is going to be so much better to getting their product across the line and receiving regulatory approval, because that's the way of the future, I think.
Great. So we do have 2 more minutes for additional questions that come from the participants. So we already have 3, but unfortunately we'll have just to pick one. So I would like to ask one question that has been submitted, which is about the fragmentation of the regulatory landscape in Asia Pacific. And we have seen that some of the regulators have issued some guidance about the use of real world evidence for regulatory decisions. However, what are your experience in terms of how can we concert the efforts to standardize these approaches and encourage, from policymaking perspective, the conversions of these fragmented approaches for regulatory authority from different regulatory authorities? Any perspective from Tracy, and then Heather?
Sure. I mean, that harmonization goal is a key goal for the countries that are members of the IMDRF, and we try to reach some level of harmonization through the guidance that we produce and our software-based medical device guidance, and we're currently working on IVD clinical guidance. I think all of the guidance that need to be reviewed in the context of the treatment or consideration of real world evidence is probably a task that could be done. The adoption of the IMDRF guidance by other countries, including those in the Asia Pacific region, would be a matter for them, but we publish information for the benefit of others, and ways of being able to incorporate other contributions is through our working groups. So I do know that other countries do belong to our working group. So that's one possibility.
Thank you very much. And Heather, you have 1 minute left.
I was just going to echo. Yeah, I'm just going to echo what Tracy said, in that I think that there's a real opportunity that we're at a pivot point with a number of countries that are already adopting. You know, we have in the EU, we have 2 of the EU guidance documents that include real world data. In the US, we have a guidance document. China, Korea, Japan has a guidance on the real world data from registries. Like, we're at a pivot point that I think that it's important for us as an ecosystem to start talking about how do we move towards harmonization. It's been a little bit too early before now, but you know, maybe in the next year or 2 we could have that as an IMDRF work item.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Heather and Tracy, for sharing your insights and expertise on real world evidence for to enable access to innovations. So I will hand it over to you, Tom, to conclude this webinar.
Thank you, Anne, for moderating this panel discussion, and thank you to our speakers as well for the wonderful discussion. So I have a minute left, so I'll quickly wrap up the conversation here. So I know there are a few questions, and we will email you back some of these. I think there were 2 questions from the audience. So what's going to happen next is, you know, now that you've heard recommendations that was proposed, so APAC Med would like to next activate this paper at the country level, but we really want to engage and share this with the policymakers and regulators. And the idea is really to support them and introduce guidelines that will help MedTech companies to adopt RWE for regulatory and reimbursement decision making. And as Clark mentioned earlier, this paper serves as a foundation piece to really help us understand the current landscape. So we are thinking of follow-up research and then really go deeper into some of the technical aspects that was beyond the scope of the paper. And lastly, we also have plans to develop a workshop on RWE with our partners So right now we're still in early phase of planning, but I think we will do this in the third quarter of this year. So please stay tuned. And before I close, I just want to mention that this webinar we posted on our website and is available to the public. So please help us spread the word. We also have other good content related to digital health. If you have any questions, please reach to our digital health team. And so once again, just want to thank our speakers, Tracy and Heather, and also accommodate time zones because Heather, you're based in the US, and Tracy, you're based in Australia. So thank you all for joining, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.